Amen. So we picked up our series on Genesis again last week, and we were first introduced to Isaac's two twin boys, Esau, which means hairy, and then Jacob, which means deceiver. And right away we see why Jacob was called deceiver, because he tricked his older brother Esau into giving up what's called his birthright, which we can understand that just as inheritance, although it goes a little bit deeper than just an inheritance, okay? In chapter 27, we actually see that Isaac doesn't just have a birthright to give, he has something called a blessing to give. Now, the Hebrew word for blessing means to kneel, and so often what would happen is if your father was going to give you a blessing, you would kneel and he would speak these words over you. And if you think of a birthright as an inheritance, a blessing is sort of, it's like a prayer that projects what you will accomplish in life. Okay, and so Isaac has this blessing to give, and usually it would go to the older son first. But what happens is while Esau is gone, Jacob's mother hatches a plan, and she says, I want you to have the blessing instead of Esau. And Jacob says, but I'm nothing like Esau. He's hairy. He smells like he's hunting all the time. He dresses a certain way. He seems a certain way. And so what the mother does is she dresses up Jacob in goat skin, so it seems like he's hairy, and puts on some of Esau's clothes so he kind of smells like Esau. And the reason she does that is because their father Isaac at the time was very poor of vision. He couldn't see well. And so he could only identify his children by the sound of their voice, but also by touch. And so Jacob goes to his father and pretends to be his older brother. And when his dad is like, you sound like Jacob, but you smell like Esau, Jacob says, here, feel how hairy I am, right? I wouldn't know what that's like, but he's like, feel how hairy I am. And the father Isaac feels Jacob and feels the goat's hair, and it's like, well, this is Esau, but it still sounds like Jacob. So he proclaims this blessing over him in Genesis chapter 7. Here's what it says. May God give you of the dew of heaven and of the fatness of the earth and plenty of grain and wine. Let people serve you and nations bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may your mother's son bow down to you. Cursed be everyone who curses you, and blessed be everyone who blessed you. All right, and so what's happening during this time is, as Isaac is giving this blessing to Jacob that was supposed to go to Esau, Esau was out hunting. And so he really has no idea that this is going on. And as I was reading this is just sort of personal, I realized that I have this strange fear of missing out on things. Does anyone else know what I'm talking about? Like, you feel like you're missing out on something, or if you're not there on time, or if you're not the first person in line, that you're going to miss out on something or other. And I started wondering, why do I feel this way? And after some expert psychoanalysis, I realized that I could trace back this fear of missing out to a specific incident when I was a kid. When I was a kid, my cousin was over, who was much older than I am, and my brother and my cousin and I were making French fries at home. And this was revolutionary because as a child, I thought you had to buy French fries from McDonald's. But apparently, you can buy these things called frozen French fries, and as long as you put enough oil into the pot, you can make your own French fries. So I was blown away because to a child, it's like unlimited French fries. I can choose how many French fries I eat. And so we would cook these fries, and then we'd put them in on a plate, and we'd let them cool. And while they were cooling, I thought, since this is an unlimited supply of French fries, let me start the next batch. So I would start the next batch, and unbeknownst to me, what was happening is my cousin and my brother, as a prank, started eating all the French fries as fast as they could. So by the time I got there, all the French fries were gone. And so I'd put the new batch on, and then I'd start another one, and I'd look, and they're not even enjoying it. They're just to make a joke. They're like stuffing their mouths as quickly as they can. And I realized from that moment on, there's a chance of me missing out on something if I'm not present. And that has It stuck with me throughout all these years, right? They thought it was funny, but to me it was actually quite traumatic. Well, I'm just missing out on French fries, right? Can you imagine if you're Esau and you come back from hunting or whatever you're doing and you found out that you didn't miss out on just French fries, you missed out on your father's blessing. And for whatever reason, the customs of the day, the blessing was an oath that couldn't be taken back. And so Esau later asked, don't you have another oath? And Isaac says, that's all I have. And it went to your brother Jacob. So he completely missed out because his brother lived up to his name of deception. And so we see later on that Esau plots to kill Jacob once his father passes away. And the mother hears about this, and she tells Jacob, you better flee. The exact word it uses in the Bible is, you better flee before your brother kills you. And I want you to go to this specific place to my brother who lives in this town called Haran. Okay, and if you remember back from earlier chapters, Abraham actually was called from Haran to Canaan. And now in order to flee, Jacob is called to run back to Haran. Okay, and here's where we find him in chapter 28, verse 10. Jacob left Beersheba and went towards Haran. And he came to a certain place and stayed there that night because the sun had set. Taking one of the stones of the place, he put it under his head and lay down in that place to sleep. And he dreamed, and behold, there was a ladder set up on the earth, and the top of it reached to heaven. And behold, the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord, the God of Abraham, your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and to your offspring. Your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, and you shall spread abroad to the west and to the east, and to the north and to the south. And in you and your offspring shall be all the families of the earth. Be blessed. Behold, I am with you and will keep you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. For I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you. Then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. And he was afraid and said, how awesome is this place! This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. So early in the morning, Jacob took the stone that he had put under his head and set it up for a pillar and poured oil on top of it. He called the name of the place Bethel, but the name of the city was Luz at the first. And then Jacob made a vow, saying, if God will be with me and will keep me in this way that I go, and will give me bread to eat and clothing to wear, so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord shall be my God. And this stone which I have set up for a pillar shall be God's house. And of all that you give me, I will give a full tenth to you. Okay, so this is pretty crazy. But put yourself in Jacob's shoes through this journey. I mean, if you think about it, what must it be like traveling away from home? Traveling away from this place that is so familiar, traveling away from your family so abruptly. Imagine if all of a sudden you heard that you had to come, you just had to leave Taipei, and you just had to go to this place. I mean, sure, it was Jacob's fault, but can you imagine him just kind of having to leave quickly without really maybe even having time to prepare? Did he have enough food for the journey? Did he have enough clothing for the journey? You know, we see here that he didn't even have a place to sleep. He didn't have time to pack a tent for this journey, but instead, all he had was a rock for a pillow. And he's walking and he's walking and he's walking, and he gets so weary that night falls, and he says, you know what, I have to stop and rest. You know, have you ever been in those situations where you're just so tired that you feel like you can just sleep anywhere? I'll just sleep right here. I don't care. I don't care if it's in the middle of the street. I don't care if people are walking around me. I need to sleep and lie down. This guy named F. Hastings describes this very well, very poetically. So I'll read what his description is. During the day, Jacob goes forward cheerfully. Night comes on at length. The path is no longer distinct. The wind moans sadly. A sense of loneliness creeps over him. Fear of Esau haunts him. He sees the figure of his brother behind this shrub and that rock. Has Esau outrun to murder him in that lonely spot? He trembles at every shadow and shudders at every sound. He thinks of the God of his father and mother and prays. He lies down in the desert. A bush is his only shelter, and a stone his hard pillow. He looks up at the dark vault, all glittering with silent stars. More intense becomes his loneliness, for the stars have no voice for him. And I know we read this, and it's just like, okay, Jacob left, and then he slept. But if you really think about it, can you imagine being alone in this wilderness, not really knowing if you're heading in the right direction, feeling so lonely, wondering how things are back home, wondering if your brother has caught up with you? I mean, this is a very, very lonely time. And Jacob, through a fault of his own, is just facing so much hardship and adversity at this moment. It must just suddenly weigh on him. The realization of, oh my gosh, what have I done? What have I gotten myself into? Has finally come crashing down on him at this moment. Forbes magazine had this article that talked about 3 ways leaders handle adversity. So the article was obviously about when adversity comes, when trials come, how do the leaders of the world, how do they handle it, and what are some tips that we can learn from them? So I just want you to think, how do you handle adversity? Some of us handle adversity very positively. Some of us handle adversity very negatively. Right? Some of us, when we encounter a hardship, we get upset. Why is this happening to me? Or we start to place blame. It's so-and-so's fault. Some of us, when we encounter adversity, we retreat, right? We shut down. We don't want to deal with it. So we just kind of enclose ourselves, and we keep to ourselves, and we don't want to hear it from anybody. We retreat. Some of us, when we face adversity and difficulty, that motivates us to try harder, right? Like all of a sudden, okay, I got to solve this problem. This is a problem that's for me to solve. I got to do something about this. Some of us, when we face these moments where life just kind of comes crashing down on us, we learn to ignore the problem. And we're very good at ignoring the problem. And we self-medicate. We run to these things that make us feel comfortable, maybe these good or bad habits, or these hobbies that help us to forget that there's actually a problem. I don't know. Some of us blame God. Some of us just get really upset. Well, Jacob slept. That was his response. Now, I understand he was tired, but in some way, this is kind of a symbol of, I just need to escape this. This is how I'm going to deal with this problem. I'm just going to deal with it later, so I'm going to sleep. I'm going to forget that it's existing. And those are some negative ways we deal with adversity. Now, the Forbes article only had 3 points and some positive ways to deal with adversity. The first one, and this is not exactly how they word it, they said, good leaders, they learn from it. When faced with adversity, good leaders say, what can this teach me? How can this improve me and my leadership ability? Another thing they do is they reinvent the future, according to Forbes, meaning they adapt. Well, this bad thing happened. Instead of me continuing to go this way, let me adapt. Let me be versatile. Right? Very good qualities to have. And the third thing was kind of interesting. They said, don't get furious, get humorously curious. I guess I had to rhyme. And basically what they're saying is good leaders, when they encounter difficulty, they don't get mad. They learn to laugh. They learn to see the humor in the situation. And reading this article is like, wow, these are very positive things. But maybe as Christians, I just want to throw this out. This message is very simple. Maybe what we need to do is stop working so hard to solve a problem. Maybe what we need to do is not even learn from the problem or reinvent and adapt, but maybe what we need more than a solution or an answer, what we need more than for things to get resolved is simply this. What we need is the presence of God. That what we need is not for things to get fixed. That what we need is not to have a positive outlook on things. That what we need is not a strategy. That what we need first and foremost, those things are not bad, but first and foremost, that what we need is God's presence to be invited into whatever hardship we're going through. Because if you read the story, that's really what turns the story. That at the beginning of this, Jacob starts out and he's pretty despondent and sad and lonely and afraid probably, and maybe even giving up to the point where he says, I just need to sleep. And then he has this encounter with God's presence. And what we see is when God's presence is invited into the situation, Jacob's outlook completely changes. And it's not through self-help positive thinking. It's through an encounter with the living God. Because when we encounter the living God, guess what? The answers don't matter. And getting what we think we need doesn't matter. Right? So Jacob has this dream. And this dream, he sees this ladder that goes from the earth to the heavens. And he sees angels going up and down this ladder. And there's a lot of interpretations as to what is going on. What is he seeing? Some scholars would say it's literally he saw a ladder that went from earth to heaven and angels going up and down, ascending and descending up this ladder. Other scholars would say Jacob probably understood it in what was going on in the Near East culture. And in the Near East culture, they would build these tall temples. And they felt that these temples was where heaven and earth intersected. And so the idea was there were these staircases going up to these tall temples, and at the very top was what they would call the high priest. And what they believed is the higher up you went this staircase or this ladder, the closer you were to heaven. So I don't know, right? There's all sorts of different theories. But you know what? It doesn't really matter. Because in the end, if you look at what really happened, simply this: Jacob had an encounter with the presence of God. And it wasn't a resolution. It wasn't a solution to the problem that fixed everything. It was actually God's presence. And we see in the Bible, time and time again, that when God's people are faced with hardships, they don't put effort only into solving the problem. They first put effort into seeking God's presence to come and be invited in the situation. Every time the early church was persecuted, they prayed, basically saying, God, come into the situation. May your presence come into the situation. And then they went out and usually preached with boldness. Every time Israel was about to go to war, they didn't prepare with military strategies. Every time they went to war, they first invited God's presence in, saying, God, will you be with us? Will you fight with us? Because no amount of strategy is going to help us win and overcome the situation. Even Jesus, when faced with difficulty and adversity, prayed. And we see in the garden, right? In the Garden of Gethsemane, before Jesus is praying, or as he's praying, he's so stressed out. He's saying, God, I don't want to go to the cross. And then he's praying, and he invites the presence of God into the situation. And does it change? No. But Jesus changes, because after inviting the presence of God into the situation, he is able to say what? Not my will, but your will. There's this term in the Bible that talks about God's presence, and sometimes it's actually, they say God's glory. Okay? It says like, this is where your glory dwells. And the Hebrew term for that is kabod. Turn to your neighbor and say kabod. And kabod literally means glory or an abundance of. But there's another connotation that is rarely used, but I think it actually fits in very well. Kabod can also be translated as weight, like heaviness. Heaviness. And so when it talks about the glory of God coming or the presence of God coming, there's this sense of there's this weightiness that occurs when God enters into a situation, into your hardship, into your difficulty. It's kind of like, I don't know if you've ever been, in a room and then with a group of people and someone really important comes in. Someone really famous, or maybe the main guest of the party. And when they walk into that room, there's like, the atmosphere changes. You know what I mean? It's like all of a sudden people kind of stop talking and they look. And there's this weight. Right? Growing up in LA, you actually run into a lot of celebrities. Not very famous ones. Well, actually pretty famous ones. And every time you could be at a restaurant and all of a sudden this celebrity walks in. And the restaurant kind of gets quiet. Because their presence carries this weight. One time, for me, it was Snoop Dogg. But I was not very happy because they gave him a table before me, and I was there first, okay? But he had some big bodyguards, so I'm not going to mess with that guy, right? But there's this sense that when God's presence comes in, there's a weightiness. You sense it. It's like, oh, there's something different in the situation. There's something different in the room. And I say that because of this. When Jacob woke up, Nothing was different, right? Everything was the same. When Jacob woke up, his brother was still out to kill him. When Jacob woke up, he had still stolen a birthright and a blessing. When Jacob woke up, he was still alone, and all he had was a rock for a pillow. When Jacob woke up, nothing was different. But yet, in those situations when we invite God's presence into our adversity and hardship, nothing is different, but yet everything is different. Amen. Right? Nothing is different. The place he lived in, it was unnamed. He didn't even know the name. There was nothing but bushes and rocks. The situation was still the same. Nothing was different. But then all of a sudden, he encounters God. He wakes up, and this place that was so ordinary, that didn't even have a name, all of a sudden he says, wow, how awesome is this place? Do you see the transformation occurring? The transformation didn't occur because all of a sudden he had an idea like, oh, here's what I'll do. Here's how I'll fix the problem. The transformation occurred because the presence of God entered his adversity, and all of a sudden, instead of the situation changing, Jacob changes. And even though nothing was different, everything was different. And he named the place Bethel, the house of God. And he took this ordinary rock, which was a pillow, and turned it into a pillar. He took this normal, ordinary thing that actually symbolized what? How lowly he was, that actually symbolized how pathetic his life was. He took this pillow and he turned it into a pillar symbolizing what? Worship. How can you go from lying on this rock, so pathetic, to all of a sudden saying, wow, this is the house of God, and breaking out into worship? Presence. The presence of God, even when nothing is different, everything is different. I just remember at such key points in my life where this occurs, and I've shared something similar about this, but there's a point in my life where after I got laid off from engineering, I did not know what to do. And God told me very clearly through a lot of wrestling and praying, you should go teach. Really? And so what's amazing is I actually got a teaching job at this pretty rough school in Anaheim, California. I had no qualifications to be a teacher, so I was like, wow, God really opened this door. And you know what I did with that gift of God? I quit. I quit. It's like, I don't need this. And I just remember being so despondent, so sad, feeling so pathetic, like I wasted this chance. Like I put myself in this desert where all I had was rocks for pillows and bushes for friends. And then there was just this time where God's presence came. It actually occurred at a hard rock Christian concert. And the lead singer of the band, he's very simply said, you know, God has a purpose for you, and no one can take that away. And I'm sitting there in the front row, like ready to, get some aggressions out and bump into some people. And he said that, I just went, I just broke down. And there was this presence I just felt this heaviness on my life. And I walked out of that concert, and you know what? Nothing was different. I was still jobless. I still messed up. But you know what? The presence of God came, and although nothing outwardly was different, everything was different. The way I looked at the situation, my heart was different. So the way I approached the problem was totally transformed because God's presence got invited in to the time of adversity. And I was able to take this pillow and turn it into a pillar. Right? Jacob did not walk out of that place after that encounter the same way. Right? And so the answer, I just want us, it's a very simple message. I just want us to see that maybe the answer is not, hey, let me give back the birthright. Or let me undo what I did. Or let me change. Maybe the answer starts with inviting the presence of God into whatever difficult situation we have. Now, don't get me wrong. Jacob still had to do something. Right? It wasn't that simple. It wasn't like God's presence came and then all of a sudden, problem is solved. Jacob still had to do something. And I know he still had to do something because he got up. He didn't just stay there. There was a journey that he had to keep going on. Right? Things were not miraculously fixed just because he had a vision. It wasn't like all of a sudden Esau was like, you know what, Jacob, that's all right. You can have all that. I don't need it. Nothing was different in that situation, but Jacob still had to do something. He had to respond. He had to get up. Right? And so when we get knocked down, yes, we need God's presence, but let me tell you, we got to get up. But the difference is he got up with a different motivation. He didn't get up because he was determined to fix it. He didn't get up because he followed Forbes magazine rule on how to deal with adversity. He got up because of why? Because of the presence of God. And what's so interesting is if you actually look at the verse again, it's not like Jacob was transformed immediately. You know how I know? When Jacob talks to God, he makes a deal. He says, God, if you do this, and you do this, and you do this, and you do this, then I'll follow you. Right? If you read his response carefully, he makes a deal. He's like, God, as long as you do this for me, then I'll give you 1/10 of everything. So has he changed? No. He's still the same guy. Right? I mean, when we first encountered him, he made a deal with Esau, saying, I'll give you this soup for your inheritance. He's still the same guy. He didn't immediately change. But what we see as we read the rest of Genesis is this episode, this encounter with God, starts him in a process of transformation. So that when he comes back to this place again, later on in the book, when he comes back to Bethel, he's actually a completely different person. Right? So outwardly, you would look at this and say, Jacob didn't really change. He's the same guy making deals. But yet God is using this and will launch him into a different trajectory. And what we see is though outwardly nothing seems different, in a sense, everything is different. But you got to get up. There's a similar story. We'll end soon. In 1 Kings, involving this prophet named Elijah. Okay, and it's kind of interesting. Now Elijah the Tishbite of Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab was a king at the time, as the Lord, the God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years, except by my word. And the word of the Lord came to him, depart from here and turn eastward and hide yourself by the brook of Cherith, which is east of the Jordan. You shall drink from the brook, and I have commanded the ravens to feed you there. Okay, so that's what's going on. God knew that this was going to be a very unpopular thing, that there's going to be no rain. And so to protect Elijah, he tells him, run away. Does that sound familiar? Flee. Okay? And you're going to drink from this brook, and I'm going to command birds to bring you food. Pretty cool. Verse 5. So he went and did according to the word of the Lord. He went and lived by the brook of Cherith, that is east of the Jordan. And the ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. After a while, the brook what? Dried up, because there was no rain. I mean, that's what he was supposed to say. And the word of the Lord came to him and said, arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. Behold, I have commanded a widow there to feed you. And he arose and went to Zarephath. Isn't this kind of, there's some parallels here, but here's what I want you to see. Elijah could have been like, when the brook dried up, he could have gotten bitter, right? He could have been like, God, what's up with this? You told me to come here, I followed you, and all of a sudden, my source of water is gone. He could have gotten very upset. He could have said, well, he could have thought, God did it this way before, how come he's not doing it this way anymore? Right, no, I've thought that a lot of times, like, man, God used to answer prayers when I did this. All of a sudden, God is not answering prayers. What is up with that, God? But even when that brook dried up, I want you to notice Elijah still got up. And he didn't leave bitter. He left obedient. What was it that caused him to be able to get up like what caused Jacob to get up? It's really this, the presence of God. God said, God came, God met him in this place of adversity. He didn't strategize on maybe I should dig some wells, or maybe I should try this place. No, the presence of God came and he got up. And so, I hope we see that through Jacob and through Elijah, we as Christians, we are called to get up. We're not called to just lie down and sleep and rest and forget the issue. But, we are called to get up after encountering the presence of God in the midst of our situation. We are called to be motivated, not by a desire to please people or a desire to just be excellent. We're called to get up. We are called to overcome because it's precisely God's presence in our lives that enables us to do that. The purpose of studying Genesis, if you remember from the very beginning, was we wanted to see that Christianity did not start in the New Testament. That Christianity did not start with the book of Matthew. Christianity did not even start with Jesus. That Christianity started in Genesis. That the God in Genesis is actually the same as the God we see in the New Testament and the God that we see today. That we have a consistent God. And this incident actually gets brought up right away in John chapter 1. Here's what it says in verse 43. The next day Jesus decided to go to Galilee. He found Philip and said to him, "Follow me." Now Philip was from Bethsaida, the city of Andrew and Peter. Philip found Nathanael and said to him, "We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph." Nathanael said to him, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Philip said to him, "Come and see." Jesus saw Nathanael coming toward him and said, "Behold, an Israelite indeed, in whom there is no deceit." Nathanael said to him, "How do you know me?" Jesus answered him, "Before Philip called you, when you were under a fig tree, I saw you." Nathanael answered him, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." Jesus answered, "Because I said to you, I saw you under a fig tree, do you believe? You will see greater things than these." Verse 51. And he said to him, "Truly, truly, I say to you, you will see heaven open and the angels of God," what? Ascending and descending. Now, when we read in Jacob's story, they were ascending and descending on what? Ladder. Now Jesus turns it around. He says, ascending and descending on the Son of Man. Someone hearing Jesus saying this right away would have thought, hey, there was a time in our history when our father Jacob had this vision of this ladder and angels ascending and descending. And that vision kind of indicated that somehow heaven was intersecting with earth at that moment. And they would remember there was this time in our father Jacob's life when he was totally lost, when he had really messed up, and in the midst of that, the presence of God came down. And if you read the passage again, God is actually reminding him of the promise he made to Abraham. And the presence of God changed what was an ordinary desert land into the house of God, Bethel. And the presence of God took a situation that from a point of view seemed similar, like nothing had been fixed. And the presence of God, even though nothing was different, everything was different. That when our father Jacob was out of options, when he had no way to fix it, God came down and said, "You're right, you have no way to fix it. You cannot fix this. I can fix this." And then they would have understood that, oh my gosh, the thing that connected heaven and earth, the conduit of God's presence was not a ladder. The conduit of God's presence is this man, Jesus. That now, when we are in situations that we have no solution, when we are in situations that we want to give up and lie down and just ignore the problem, the presence of God comes in Jesus to remind us, I am with you. After all, Jesus' name, Emmanuel, is translated God, what? With us. Presence in the midst of our problem. Presence in the midst of adversity. And so the reason, Pearl Church, we even have access to the presence of God, to the weight, the kabod is because of what Jesus did. That he opened up that intersection between heaven and earth. And that now we can get up, but not by our own strength. We can get up because we've encountered the living God who is able to sustain us through whatever we go through.